The air inside Millie's diner always carried a faint scent of brewed coffee and worn leather boots. Emily Carter, 26 years old and full of quiet determination, slid a notepad into her apron pocket and greeted her first table of the evening with a smile that had become second nature. Her shifts began at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and often stretched past midnight, the hours folding into one another in a blur of refilled mugs, clinking silverware, and occasional laughter from corner booths. But Emily wasn't just a waitress. She was also a student, enrolled in evening business classes at a small local college. By day, she studied corporate structures and marketing strategies. By night, she poured coffee and memorized regulars' orders. It was a life of split identities. At school, she dreamed aloud about boardrooms and product pitches. At the diner, she listened patiently as customers vented about their jobs, their kids, their lives. She rarely spoke of her own dreams. Her schedule was exhausting. Wake at 7 o'clock in the morning, study until noon, rest if she could, then rush to the diner by late afternoon. She carried textbooks in her bag, sometimes reading between lulls in service or during her short meal breaks. Her world was built on the idea of someday she would trade her apron for a blazer, the coffee station for a conference table. Emily had never been given much. Her parents had worked retail jobs all their lives, and when her father fell ill 2 years earlier, she became the household's main provider. She didn't complain. There was a calm resilience in the way she moved through the world, as though she had made peace with the hard parts of her story, using them as fuel. Her co-workers admired her, even if they didn't fully understand her ambition. "You're always reading those business books," one of the line cooks had once teased. "Planning to buy this place?" She had laughed it off, but deep inside, she knew her goals reached far beyond any single diner. Outside the glass windows, the world moved quickly. Suits passed by during lunch hours, drivers honked at red lights, and families gathered after church on Sundays. Emily observed it all while wiping tables and refilling napkin dispensers, each task another step in the long staircase she was climbing. There were nights when it felt impossible, when her eyes burned from tiredness and the sting of spilled coffee or rude remarks made her question everything. But then, there were moments, a kind tip, a heartfelt thank you, a quiet hour of reading the back room, that reminded her why she kept going. She was building something, even if no one else could see it yet. The diner's regulars came to know her rhythm. She remembered names, noticed when someone ordered decaf instead of regular, and asked about grandchildren or work shifts. To them, Emily was reliable, steady. They didn't know about her classes or her late-night essays. She didn't tell them. Each evening, after clocking out, she would walk 2 blocks to the bus stop, clutching her coat tighter against the wind. Her apartment was small, but it was hers. A desk, a lamp, a stack of textbooks organized by course. Some nights she would fall asleep with the light still on, highlighter in hand, her notebook open to a page filled with company case studies and financial terms. It was a quiet hustle, no fanfare, no applause. But Emily knew her efforts weren't invisible, not to the universe and not to herself. She believed that persistence, however unseen, was powerful, that even if the world seemed uninterested in her journey now, one day it would notice. One day, the long hours, the patience, the countless small decisions to keep going, they would lead somewhere unexpected. She just didn't know that somewhere would begin with a single, offhand comment from a stranger in a suit one rainy evening at the diner. The evening rush came in waves, just like always. Families sliding into booths, college students clinging to coffee mugs, truckers stopping by for late dinners. Emily moved through it all with practiced grace. Her steps quick, her voice warm, her mind half distracted by a group that had just entered through the glass door. 4 men and 1 woman, all dressed in sharp suits, expensive watches flashing as they shook off the October chill. They didn't belong to the usual crowd. They claimed the corner booth, the one often left open for large parties or the occasional birthday celebration. Emily approached with her usual smile, pad in hand, already sensing the shift in the room's energy. They looked like power, leaned back with the ease of people used to being catered to, their voices a little louder than necessary. "Welcome to Millie's," she began, flipping her notepad open. "Can I start you off with something to drink?" The man in the center barely glanced at her. Tall, early 40s, clean-cut with the kind of confidence that didn't ask permission to occupy space. His suit was tailored, the dark blue fabric clinging perfectly to his shoulders. A gold pen rested in his breast pocket, and his voice, when he finally spoke, was smooth but clipped. "Coffee. Black. And make it strong. It's been a long day." Emily nodded, her tone unchanged. "Of course. And for the rest of you?" As she took the rest of the table's orders, the man's gaze flicked to her name tag. "Emily," he said, tasting the name like it held some amusement. She met his eyes briefly, but didn't comment. Once she stepped away, she heard the tail end of a joke. Something about how he needed more than caffeine to survive another meeting with these boardroom optimists. The others laughed politely. Emily focused on the order, keeping her pace steady, but when she returned with a tray of drinks, something shifted. As she set the mugs down, she placed a cappuccino in front of the woman who had asked for it. The CEO, though she didn't know his name yet, arched an eyebrow and leaned back in his seat. "That's interesting," he said, not to anyone in particular. A waitress correcting a customer. The air around the table froze for half a second. Emily felt it, like a change in barometric pressure. The woman at the table looked down, cheeks coloring slightly. One of the other men smirked behind his glass. "I didn't correct anyone," Emily said calmly. "Just following the order." He chuckled, shaking his head. "You've got a little fire, I'll give you that." Most just nod and smile. Emily didn't reply. She simply finished placing the rest of the mugs and stepped back. But inside, her chest burned, not with anger, but with something colder. The kind of sting that came not from what was said, but from a knowledge that had been said with such ease, such disregard. Not even personal. Just casual dismissal, as if she weren't a person at all, just part of the background. She returned to the counter and busied herself with refills, but her ears kept catching fragments of their conversation. Financial strategies, expansion plans, recruitment bottlenecks. They spoke freely, oblivious or unconcerned about who might be listening. Then came the name, Brandon Hale. She didn't need to look twice. It was the same name on the textbook she'd used last semester. Case studies from Hale and Orion, one of the largest consulting firms in the region. Brandon Hale was a face behind the brand. The CEO often quoted in articles about modern leadership and innovation. And now he sat 20 feet from her, sipping coffee, unaware that the woman he had just subtly mocked had read about a career trajectory, had written essays analyzing his strategic decisions. Later in the evening, as they prepared to leave, Emily cleared the table. The group had moved on from business talk to lighter topics: travel, golf, private schools. As she reached for the empty mugs, Brandon looked up. "You're fast on your feet," he said, his tone still casual, still detached. "Ever consider a job where that kind of skill actually gets noticed?" Emily kept her posture straight. All jobs matter. Some just get more credit than others. Brandon tilted his head, mildly intrigued. Fair point. She walked away before he could say anything else. When they finally left, she exhaled slowly, almost surprised at the tightness in her chest. It wasn't humiliation, not exactly. It was something more complicated. Frustration, maybe, a sense of being seen and not seen at the same time. To him, she was just another face, another server. He would go home and forget the encounter by morning. She, on the other hand, would carry the memory like a stone in her pocket. Small, but impossible to ignore. At the end of her shift, while wiping down the counter, an older man who had been sitting near the window approached quietly. "You handled yourself well," he said, placing a $10 bill in the tip jar. "Not everyone does." Emily looked up, caught off guard. "Thank you." He gave her a nod and walked out into the night. Later, on the bus ride home, her thoughts were restless. She opened her phone and pulled up the Hale and Orion website. Sleek, corporate, filled with buzzwords about innovation, leadership, vision. Brandon Hale's face stared back from a About Us page, smiling, professional, powerful. Emily studied it for a long moment, then closed the tab. She didn't know what she expected to feel, anger maybe or discouragement, but instead, What settled over her was something quieter. A challenge, unspoken but real. The next time they met, if they ever did, he would remember her, and not as a waitress with quick feet. She wasn't looking for revenge. She didn't want pity or even an apology. What she wanted, what she had always wanted, was to matter, to walk into a room and be listened to have her ideas heard not in spite of her background, but because she had earned that seat at the table. The road ahead still looked long and uncertain. But that night, something changed. Not because of what Brandon Hale said, but because of what he failed to see. And that, Emily realized, was exactly where her strength would begin. The next morning began quietly. A thin layer of mist clung to the streets outside Emily's apartment window, softening the outlines of the buildings beyond. She brewed instant coffee, half awake, half lost in thoughts she hadn't been able to quiet since the night before. The encounter at the diner had replayed itself in fragments, over and over. The way the executives had laughed, the sharp glint in Brandon Hale's eyes when it spoken to her as though she were invisible. She didn't want to dwell on it. It had been a single evening, a passing moment in a long week. People like him lived in a world far removed from hers, one built on polished glass and private drivers, where words like respect and humility existed mostly in company mission statements. Still, something inside her had cracked open. It wasn't anger anymore. It was awareness. She had seen up close what that kind of power looked like, and how easily it dismissed the people beneath it. When she arrived at the diner that afternoon, the mood was ordinary again. The same fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The same coffee percolated behind the counter, and the same voices filled the air. Yet Emily felt different, like the world had subtly tilted, and she was standing slightly off balance. "Rough night?" asked Marlene, the senior waitress who'd worked at Millie's for nearly 2 decades. She was wiping down the soda machine, her tone casual but perceptive. "Not rough," Emily said, slipping into her apron. "Just strange." Marlene gave her a knowing look. Strange usually means someone said something stupid. "What happened?" Emily hesitated. "Just a customer. One of those who forgets you're human." "Ah," Marlene said, nodding. "The kind with the fancy suit and the empty manners." Emily smiled faintly. Something like that. She didn't tell Marlene who the man was. It felt irrelevant, or maybe too important. Instead, she threw herself into work, moving between tables with practiced rhythm. But as the day wore on, her focus wavered. She noticed details she had never truly paid attention to before. The way customers sometimes avoided eye contact when handing her money, the clipped tone of a hurried businessman tapping his phone while ordering, the occasional condescending sweetheart or darling toss her way. None of it was new, yet suddenly it all felt heavier, sharper. Late in the afternoon, a man about her father's age sat at the counter. He had been there the night before, though she hadn't realized until he waved her over with a friendly smile. "You're Emily, right?" he asked, his voice gentle, calm. "That's right," she said, setting down a napkin and filling his cup. "I saw what happened yesterday," he said quietly. "That man shouldn't have spoken to you like that." She froze for a moment, caught off guard by the kindness in his tone. "It's fine," she replied automatically. "It's not," the man said. "You handled it better than most would. But don't ever let someone make you feel small because of what you do. The world runs on people like you." Emily looked at him then, really looked, and saw the sincerity in his eyes. He wasn't trying to comfort her out of pity. He was reminding her of something she already knew, but had momentarily forgotten. "Thank you," she said softly. He smiled and returned to his meal. When he left, she found a small note tucked under the edge of his plate. It said, "Keep your head up. The world has a funny way of turning tables." She folded the paper carefully and slipped it into her apron pocket. That night, after closing, Emily sat alone in one of the booths. The lights dimmed except for the glow from the street outside. The diner was quiet, only the hum of the refrigerator breaking the silence. She stared at the note, reading it again and again, the words settling somewhere deep inside. Maybe it wasn't about pride or dignity. Maybe it was about self-belief, the quiet kind that didn't need validation. She thought about her studies, about the night she had stayed up reviewing corporate structures and leadership theories. Brandon Hale was just a man. Successful, yes, but still human. And if he could build something from ambition and strategy, so could she. A sudden clap of thunder rattled the windows, pulling her out of thought. She closed the diner, locked the doors, and stepped into the rain. The walk to the bus stop was short, but soaked her entirely. She didn't care. The rain washed away the last trace of bitterness that had clung to her since that night. The next day, during her lunch break at the diner, she opened her laptop and scrolled through company listings. She had been meaning to apply for internships for months, but hesitation always stopped her. Her resume felt unimpressive, her experience ordinary. But that afternoon, something shifted. Ordinary didn't mean incapable. It just meant she hadn't had the right chance yet. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She typed out her resume from scratch, trimming unnecessary lines, focusing on her strengths: organization, teamwork, communication. She described her role at the diner not as waitress, but as customer relations and operation support. And for the first time, it didn't feel dishonest. It felt accurate. By the time her break ended, she had sent 5 applications. That evening, she told Marlene about it. "You applied for corporate jobs?" Marlene asked, eyebrows raised. "Entry-level positions," Emily clarified, smiling a little. "I don't expect much, but I figure it's time to try." Marlene laughed. "Good for you, kid. Just promise me you won't forget us little people when you're running some big office one day." "I could never forget this place," Emily said and meant it. That night, as she walked home on the glow of the streetlights, she felt lighter than she had in weeks. She had taken a small step, one she could control. The world still felt vast and indifferent, but she was no longer waiting for it to notice her. She was walking toward it. The memory of Brandon Hale's dismissive tone no longer stung the same way. Instead, it had become something else, a reminder perhaps, or even a spark. He had seen her as insignificant. One day, she decided, she would prove that no one truly is. And when that day came, she wouldn't need him to acknowledge it. She would already know. The silence in Emily's apartment that Sunday night was different. It wasn't heavy like before, weighed down by exhaustion or lingering embarrassment. Instead, it was focused, sharp, expectant. Her laptop sat open on the small table by the window. The glow of the screen reflected faintly in her eyes. She had already sent out several applications during the week, but something in her told her that this wasn't enough. Not yet. She stared at the cursor blinking beside the text box labeled company name. Her fingers hovered for a moment, then began to type. Hale and Orion. She didn't pause. She didn't hesitate. Her chest tightened slightly as she wrote out the name, but she pushed forward. The idea had come to her earlier in the day, somewhere between mopping floors at the diner and solving a marketing case study for school. It felt absurd and bold and wildly optimistic, but also right. She searched their careers page. Most positions required advanced degrees or years of experience, but one listing caught her eye. Junior operations assistant, entry level. The responsibilities were broad, supporting logistics, helping organize events, internal scheduling. Nothing glamorous, but very real. Real enough to be a foot in the door. She clicked apply now. She tailored her resume again, rewriting sections to focus on her multitasking under pressure, her problem-solving skills, and her communication abilities. She added a short but sincere cover letter, weaving in her studies, her aspirations, and the way she wanted to learn by doing. There was no bitterness in her tone. She didn't mention where they had met. This wasn't about calling out a past insult. It was about stepping into her future. When she clicked submit, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The next morning, she moved through her day with a subtle undercurrent of anticipation. She didn't expect much. In truth, she had sent the application as an act of courage more than strategy. But by Wednesday, a reply landed in her inbox. The subject line read, Hale and Orion, interview invitation. Emily stood frozen in the middle of the diner's back office, her phone in hand, reading the email 3 times before the words truly settled. They wanted to schedule an interview. A real interview. "Everything okay?" asked Jared, the evening cook. Poking his head in, Yeah, Emily said slowly, her voice almost disbelieving. Actually more than okay. That night, back in her apartment, she prepared with military precision. She pulled out her best blouse, ironed her slacks, and rehearsed answers to common interview questions. She researched Hale and Orion again, not just Brandon Hale, but the entire company, its history, values, community projects, and key departments. She wanted to walk into that room not as a waitress trying to prove herself, but as a professional ready to grow. On the morning of the interview, she took the earliest bus downtown. She arrived half an hour early and waited in the building's atrium, heart-thudding but hand-steady. The lobby was sleek, with walls of glass and soft white lighting. Everyone moved with purpose, and for a moment she felt like an outsider, but then she reminded herself she had earned this opportunity. The receptionist greeted her with a smile and directed her to the 7th floor. The elevator doors opened into a minimalist hallway lined with modern art. A woman in a gray suit met her and introduced herself as Diane, the recruitment coordinator. They sat in a small conference room with a view over the city. Diane offered her water, then opened a folder. "Thanks for coming in, Emily. We received a lot of applications, but yours stood out. Your cover letter was direct and refreshingly honest." Emily smiled, trying not to show her surprise. "Thank you. I tried to be as clear as possible." Diane asked about her background, her current job, her coursework. Emily spoke with calm confidence, framing her experience not as a limitation, but as a foundation. She described handling high-pressure situations during weekend rushes, coordinating with different personalities, staying organized while juggling multiple responsibilities. "At the diner, we don't always get detailed instructions," she said. "So you learn to anticipate needs. You learn to solve things before they become problems." Diane nodded. "That's actually a key part of operations, flexibility and foresight." As the interview continued, Emily's nerves began to fade. She wasn't pretending to be someone she wasn't. She was showing them who she was becoming. When Diane asked where she saw herself in 5 years, Emily paused before answering. "I hope to grow inside a company that values initiative. I'm still learning, but I'm not afraid to start at the bottom. I just want the chance to contribute and improve every step of the way." After the interview, Diane walked her back to the elevator and said they would be in touch soon. Emily thanked her sincerely, stepped inside, and watched the floors count down. Outside, the city felt brighter, louder, full of motion. She found a quiet bench a block away and sat for a while, letting it all sink in. She had just interviewed at Hale and Orion. She had faced the impossible and kept her ground. She didn't allow herself to hope too much, but she allowed just enough. Enough to imagine what it might be like to walk into a place like that every morning, not as a server, but as a team member. Enough to believe that maybe this bold step could actually become a new chapter. 2 days later, the call came. She was offered the position. The voice on the other end of the line was the same Diane from before, cheerful and warm. "We were really impressed by your mindset, Emily. We think you'd be a great fit. If you're still interested, we'd love to have you on board." Emily was sitting on her bed, her back against the wall, laptop open beside her. She blinked twice before answering. Yes, I'm definitely interested." They discussed the start date, the onboarding process, and a few paperwork details. After the call ended, Emily didn't move for a full minute. Her chest ached, not from fear, but from the weight of something lifting. She stood slowly and walked to the window. Outside, the city moved on as it always did. But to Emily, the view looked entirely different. Everything had changed. The first morning of Emily's new life began with a nervous breath and a cautious optimism. She had turned in her notice at the diner with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. Marlene had pulled her into a hug that smelled like coffee and cinnamon and whispered, "Go make us proud, kid." Now, standing in front of her bedroom mirror, dressed in a soft gray blouse and neatly pressed slacks, Emily Carter looked like the version of herself she had only imagined until now. She arrived at the towering building of Hale and Orion 15 minutes early, security badge in hand, hair pulled back into a professional knot. A part of her wondered if she'd catch a glimpse of Brandon Hale again, if he would pass by without recognition. But another part of her Stronger Now was focused on something else entirely: learning, adapting, proving she belonged not because of who she knew, but because of what she brought. Diane greeted her at reception, handed her a welcome packet, and guided her through the onboarding steps. Emily was placed in the operations department, under the supervision of Colin Bryant, a structured and observant team leader in his late 30s. His office was lined with color-coded files and sticky notes meticulously arranged on a board behind his desk. "Emily Carter," he said, glancing up from her profile. "You're not the most conventional hire I've had, but your application stood out for a reason." "I'm ready to work hard," she said plainly. "Good," he replied, "because around here, results talk louder than resumes." The first few days were overwhelming. The digital systems were unfamiliar. The terminology often flew over her head, and the meetings moved at a pace she wasn't used to. But she didn't panic. She took notes, pages and pages of them. She stayed late when needed, asked careful questions, and observed everything. Her desk was small, tucked near the back of a low-traffic corner of the operations floor. From there, she had a partial view of the glass-walled conference rooms where decisions were made. Every now and then, she caught glimpses of executives moving briskly through the halls, their conversations clipped and full of intent. She still hadn't seen Brandon Hale again. By her second week, Colin began assigning her small tasks: calendar coordination, room scheduling, basic budget reports. She treated each one like it mattered. When a spreadsheet came in half complete from another department, she didn't just forward the issue. She called the department herself, clarified the missing data, and restructured the sheet before submitting it. Colin noticed. "You took initiative," he said, reviewing her work. Most assistants would have passed it off. "I thought it would save time," she said, trying not to seem too eager. He nodded. It did. Though her title was minor, Emily started picking up patterns others overlooked. She noticed that certain teams duplicated work due to communication breakdowns. She realized that an outdated template was still being used in internal summaries. Quietly, without fanfare, she made subtle improvements and documented them for review. It was on a rainy Wednesday afternoon that her work reached a wider audience. One of the junior analysts had fallen ill the day before an internal audit presentation. Colin, under pressure, asked Emily if she could compile a set of clean summaries for a small section of the report, something he could plug into the main deck. She stayed late, working from an empty meeting room, going over documents line by line. She double-checked figures, clarified discrepancies, and even included brief notes explaining variances. When she handed the packet to Colin the next morning, he didn't say much. But that afternoon, she was copied on an email to the audit team. It read, "Excellent supporting analysis, clear, accurate, and easy to present. Credit to E. Carter in Ops for the assist." It was the first time her name had appeared in an internal memo. Later that week, Colin asked her to sit in on a department meeting just to observe. She took notes silently but was surprised when he turned to her near the end and said, "Emily, anything stand out to you?" She hesitated. All eyes turned to her. "Well," she began carefully, "I noticed that 3 teams mentioned issues with the internal platform updates. They're all describing different symptoms, but I think they're actually reacting to the same bug." There was a moment of silence. One of the senior staff looked skeptical, but another nodded slowly. "That makes sense." After the meeting, Colin pulled her aside. "Don't be afraid to speak up. You've got good instincts." She carried those words with her for the rest of the day. They were small, almost offhand, but they echoed in her mind with the weight of real progress. This wasn't just a job anymore. It was a chance to build something real. One afternoon, about a month into her role, she received a short message from Diane asking if she would be available for a quick call later that day. Emily agreed, curious but calm. At precisely 3 o'clock, her phone rang. "Emily," Diane said warmly, "I wanted to touch base. There's a new initiative coming up company-wide, but with a strong operations component. The leadership team is looking for cross-department support, and I mentioned you as someone with strong adaptability and attention to detail." Emily sat straighter. "I'd be honored to help." "It's early days," Diane said, "but I think it could be a good opportunity. I'll loop you in when the first prep meetings are scheduled." After they hung up, Emily sat in silence, staring out the window across the city skyline. She thought of the note the old man had left at the diner weeks ago. The world has a funny way of turning tables. She was still at the start, still learning, still proving. But doors were opening, not because of chance, because she had walked through them, one deliberate step at a time. The project Diane had hinted at unfolded quickly. Within a week, Emily found herself added to an internal mailing list titled Event 2025_Team Sync. She received a calendar invite to a coordination meeting, hosted on the 11th floor, a floor she had never been to, home to the executive wing, where directors and department heads made decisions that rippled across the entire company. She was no longer just assisting with spreadsheets or scheduling logistics. She had been placed on the support team for Hale and Orion's first ever internal summit, an initiative designed to unite employees across departments and branches for a 3-day collaboration and innovation showcase. Emily's role was classified as logistics assistant, but her access to planning sessions meant she would be exposed to high-level discussions. On the morning of the first coordination meeting, she arrived early and waited outside the assigned room, feeling slightly out of place. Employees passed by with confident strides, ID badges clipped to tailored blazers, laughing softly as they spoke in the jargon of high-level planning. She clutched her notebook a little tighter. The door opened, and a tall woman with short silver hair stepped out. "Emily Carter?" "Yes," she replied quickly, standing. "I'm Annika. I'll be leading this initiative. Come in, we're about to start." Inside, the space was modern and bright, with a long conference table surrounded by chairs and a digital screen projecting the event's draft outline. Emily sat quietly while people filled the room. There were 10 in total, some from operations, some from marketing, others from finance and HR. Emily was the youngest by far. Annika began the meeting with sharp precision. "This summit is more than a formality. The CEO wants to re-energize the company. Departments have been siloed for too long. We're overdue for collaboration." She clicked through slides showing schedules, themes, and responsibilities. Emily listened closely, jotting notes furiously. They were planning sessions, networking panels, even live workshops. Her job would include organizing resource materials, ensuring venues were properly set up, and managing interdepartmental communication to ensure everyone knew where to be and when. It was a lot, but it was also exciting. Annika closed the meeting with direct instructions. "Everyone, I expect weekly progress reports. Problems flagged early. We go live in 5 weeks. Let's move." The team dispersed, and as Emily rose to leave, Annika called out to her, "Emily, walk with me." They stepped into the corridor, where light filtered in from tall glass windows. "I've heard good things about you," Annika said. "You don't talk much in meetings, but your prep notes were the most comprehensive I received." Emily blinked. "Thank you. I've been trying to stay ahead." "Good. Keep that energy. This project is chaotic, but it's where real leaders show up." As they parted ways, Emily felt a rush of something rare, affirmation, not the usual polite nods or vague praise, but genuine recognition. Back at her desk that afternoon, she reviewed her tasks. She was responsible for consolidating accommodation plans for out-of-town staff, cross-checking workshop leader schedules, and finalizing the tech support list for 3 event locations. While it sounded dry on paper, the reality was a web of details with no room for error. She approached each task like an engineer, building systems where others saw lists. Colin noticed a shift in her workload. "You've got your hands full," he said one day, eyeing her screen. "I can handle it." Emily replied without looking up. "I don't doubt it," he said and walked away. But the more she became involved, the more she noticed things that didn't sit right. Certain departments ignored emails. Some managers passed tasks to interns without proper oversight. People promised deliverables in meetings, but failed to follow through. There was a disconnect between departments, and at the center of it all was an invisible layer of hierarchy, one that often shut out the younger or less established employees. At a Thursday check-in, Emily asked whether feedback from junior staff would be incorporated into the summit's open forum discussions. "Not directly," said a manager from HR. "The panels will be led by team heads." But the junior staff are the ones closest to the company's daily operations, Emily said cautiously. If the goal is transparency and engagement, wouldn't including their voices make the summit stronger? The room went quiet for a moment. Then Annika looked up from her tablet. She has a point, she said. Let's consider adding a junior-led roundtable. Emily drafted a proposal. After the meeting, a few staff members approached her quietly with words of thanks or nods of support. It wasn't loud praise, but it was meaningful. Emily realized that speaking up, carefully, intentionally, had power. The weeks moved fast. Her days blurred between spreadsheets, vendor calls, team check-ins, and late-night revisions. She lost count of how many hours she spent adjusting floor plans and confirming attendee lists. But she didn't complain. She was building trust in small increments. One evening, while reviewing printing logistics for signage, Emily passed by a side hallway that led toward the executive offices. She rarely ventured there, but a courier had dropped off a box meant for one of the summit's keynote speakers. The label said, "Hail, Private." She carried it to the end of the corridor, heart pounding slightly. When she reached the glass-paneled door, she paused, unsure if she should knock. Before she could, it opened from the inside. Brandon Hale stood there, glancing at his watch. He looked up, surprised to see her. "Yes," he said, his tone brisk but not unkind. "I have a delivery," Emily said, holding the box. He took it from her hands, pausing only for a moment. "Thank you." Their eyes met, just briefly. She didn't say anything else. She nodded and turned to leave. As she walked back to her desk, her hands didn't tremble. There was no rush of vindication or confrontation, just a quiet understanding. He didn't recognize her, and that was fine. She didn't need him to. Not yet. She would keep building, keep listening, keep leading in the spaces where no one expected it. And when the summit came, when the company gathered and the lights dimmed and the voices rose in unison around new ideas, she would be there, not in the spotlight, but as one of the people who made it all happen. That was enough. For now, 3 weeks before the summit, the rhythm at Hale and Orion reached a near-frantic pace. Deadlines loomed like dark clouds. Emails came in faster than they could be answered, and the once calm office corridors now echoed with tense conversations and hurried footsteps. Emily had never experienced this level of pressure in any job or classroom, but oddly, she thrived in it. She had found her rhythm. While others panicked over late deliveries or conflicting schedules, Emily remained composed. She didn't raise her voice or demand attention. Instead, she solved problems before they escalated. When a vendor missed a materials drop-off, she called 3 alternate suppliers, had backup options priced and ready, and negotiated an emergency delivery, all before her manager even knew there was an issue. Her ability to predict obstacles and resolve them became her quiet trademark. One afternoon, as she worked on color-coded layouts for workshop rotations, 2 senior staffers from operations passed behind her. They weren't speaking to her, but she caught the tail end of their exchange. "Is that the new girl?" one asked. "The one from Diane's shortlist. Emily something. She's efficient, doesn't say much but gets things done." Emily didn't turn around. She didn't need the praise. What mattered was that people were beginning to see her, not as a favor hire or a temporary assistant, but as someone capable, someone essential. Colin, her direct supervisor, had started giving her more autonomy. He no longer hovered over her tasks or double-checked her emails before they were sent to cross-functional teams. He trusted her judgment. One morning, he handed her a small stack of files and said, "Sort out the scheduling conflict with logistics and marketing. You'll need to negotiate shared access to the river room." Emily nodded. "I'll handle it." The river room was the most sought-after space in the entire building, with floor-to-ceiling windows and state-of-the-art audio-visual tech. Both departments had claimed it for overlapping time slots during the summit. When Emily entered the negotiation meeting between the 2 managers, she wasn't expected to speak, only to take notes. But after 15 minutes of polite but fruitless back and forth, she raised her hand slightly. "I think I see a compromise," she said. Both men looked at her, surprised. If the logistics session moves forward by 30 minutes and marketing agrees to set up in the smaller cedar room for the pre-recording prep, We can avoid overlap and maintain the technical integrity for both sessions. They considered her suggestion. That could work, one said slowly. Draw it up, said the other. We'll approve if it aligns with the schedule. Emily returned to her desk and sent the revised plan within the hour. It was approved by both teams without further discussion. From that day, she began receiving direct invitations to smaller meetings, not just as note-taker or assistant, but as a contributing planner. Still, not everyone saw her potential clearly. In one session, a mid-level executive named Greg brushed past her in the hallway, handing her a stack of printouts. Be a dear and make 20 copies of these before the 10 o'clock, will you? Emily didn't flinch. She handed the papers to a nearby admin and returned to her own task, finalizing a presentation slide deck that would be reviewed by the executive leadership. Later that day, Greg walked into a meeting where Emily was presenting progress updates to the Summit Strategic Review Committee. His face registered mild surprise when he saw her seated at the table instead of standing near the coffee station. She greeted him professionally and continued without acknowledgement of the earlier incident. Her ideas were gaining traction. She had proposed a digital feedback loop for the summit, allowing real-time responses via QR codes posted around event spaces. The suggestion was simple, modern, and easy to implement. IT loved it. Marketing requested access to the responses for post-event campaigns. The executive sponsor of the summit signed off on the idea the same day. One evening, as the office emptied out, Annika stopped by Emily's desk. "You're doing excellent work," she said. "You don't talk much, but when you do, people listen." Emily looked up, surprised. "Thank you. I'm just trying to make sure things go smoothly." Annika nodded. "That's exactly what makes the difference. Keep it up." After she left, Emily sat in stillness for a few seconds, letting the compliment settle in. Praise wasn't something she chased, but hearing it from someone like Annika made her feel like her quiet efforts were finally echoing beyond her own desk. That weekend, Emily received a message from one of her classmates at the local college. They had seen her name mentioned in a Hale and Orion internal newsletter shared by a professor. It highlighted her initiative on the summit planning and her role in developing the feedback loop system. "I didn't know you worked there now," the message read. "That's incredible." Emily replied simply, "It's been a journey, still learning every day." It was true. She still felt like she was navigating a foreign country, one with its own language, customs, and expectations. But she was becoming fluent. Each decision she made, each problem she solved, each piece of recognition earned through effort, not favor, it all added to her foundation. One afternoon, during a team-wide strategy session, the conversation turned to succession planning and internal mentorship. The senior advisor facilitating the meeting asked, "How do we spot emerging leaders early, especially the ones who don't raise their hands first?" Colin spoke without hesitation. "You look for the ones already solving problems no one else sees. They're not loud, but they're essential, like Emily Carter." The room went quiet for a beat. Then heads turned toward her, nodding. She felt the shift. It was subtle but powerful. She had entered Hale and Orion as a nobody. Now, she was being named in conversations about leadership potential. She still hadn't crossed paths with Brandon Hale again, not directly. Occasionally, she saw him in passing, speaking to high-level staff, walking through the building with intent. But she didn't need a confrontation. She didn't even need acknowledgement. Her strength wasn't in being noticed. It was in being valuable. And she was quietly but undeniably becoming exactly that. The week before the summit began with a new challenge. Annika called an emergency planning session with the core logistics team. Emily arrived early as always and took her place at the table, not at the edge, but directly beside Annika, a silent acknowledgement that her voice now belonged in the room. Once everyone had settled, Annika stood with a tablet in hand and spoke briskly. "Brandon Hale wants a community engagement element added to the summit," she said. "Something public-facing, ideally tied to our company values. It's last minute, but we have a narrow window to pitch ideas. We need something that shows we're not just about growth, but about impact." There was a moment of shared hesitation. The summit was already planned down to minute. Every room was booked, every slot filled. A new component, especially one involving the community, would demand permissions, coordination, and marketing, none of which had been prepared. Does it have to happen during the summit? Someone asked. Annika didn't look up from her screen. Yes, and it must feel organic, not like a corporate stunt. Emily listened as the room fell into scattered brainstorming. Ideas floated. Donation drives, scholarship announcements, employee-led cleanup projects, but none felt substantial. None aligned with the tone of the summit, which centered on innovation and long-term strategy. Then, slowly, Emily raised her hand. I have an idea, she said. The others quieted. What if we invite students from local under-resourced schools to attend a session? She continued. A half-day workshop, focused on career readiness, resume writing, interview prep, basic business literacy, hosted by our employees. No branding, no sales pitches, just mentorship and exposure. Annika looked up. Go on. Emily steadied her voice. We have hundreds of professionals here for the summit. Many of them started with nothing, but were given a chance. Why not pass that forward? We could dedicate one morning, invite a select number of high school juniors and seniors, pair them with volunteer staff members. Keep it small, high impact. We give, they gain. A thoughtful silence followed. That's actually good, said Colin, arms crossed but nodding. Very good, Annika added, tapping her tablet. Emily, build it out. I want a full proposal by tomorrow. Identify schools, outline the program, and give me projected numbers. If it holds, I'll pitch it to Hale myself. Emily didn't sleep much that night. She researched local schools with limited access to career development programs. She created a schedule, student arrival, breakout sessions, one-on-one mentoring time. She emailed a contact from her community college to request a list of guidance counselors who might connect her with interested schools. By morning, the plan was complete. She titled it, Step Forward. Annika reviewed it during call, her voice unusually enthusiastic. Well done. This might be the most authentic thing we've done in years. 3 days later, Brandon Hale approved the project personally. Emily didn't meet with him directly. The message came through Annika, who said simply, he liked it. He signed off immediately. The following week was a blur. Emily became the project lead for Step Forward, coordinating with school administrators, arranging transport logistics, and recruiting employee volunteers. Her inbox overflowed with staff eager to participate. Some even shared their own backgrounds. First-generation college students, former wait staff, immigrant professionals, people who remembered what it was like to be unseen. The day before the event, Emily stood in the newly cleared West Conference Hall, watching his maintenance team set up folding chairs and interactive booths. She checked the printed programs, retested the microphones, and walked the schedule through minute by minute. It had to be perfect. When the buses arrived the next morning, Emily greeted each group personally. The students, some wide-eyed, others guarded, stepped into a world unlike anything they'd seen before. She saw herself in many of them, young, curious, unsure of their place in the world. The workshop began with a short welcome, followed by breakout sessions on topics like communication skills, resume strategies, and navigating job interviews. Volunteers guided students through mock interviews, shared their own paths, and answered questions candidly. The most powerful moment came during the closing circle. One student stood, hesitant at first, then said clearly, I didn't think people like you would care about people like me, but now I know I was wrong. Silence fell across the room. Then, soft applause. Real, heartfelt, echoing across the space. Annika found Emily after the event ended, as the students were boarding the buses back to their schools. You changed the tone of this summit, she said. You made it about more than numbers. This is what leadership looks like. Emily didn't know how to answer. Her heart was too full, not with pride, but with something deeper, a sense of alignment. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just contributing. She was leading with purpose. That afternoon, her name appeared on the internal portal under the headline, Emerging Voices. The article detailed her initiative, the success of Step Forward, and included a quote from one of the school principals praising the event as the most meaningful corporate partnership we've ever experienced. Emily received dozens of messages from colleagues, many she had never met, thanking her, praising her, asking how they could be involved next time. But perhaps the most unexpected moment came late that evening. She received a calendar notification for a one-on-one meeting. The organizer, Brandon Hale. Subject line, leadership culture and the next step. She stared at the screen, pulse quickening. He knew who she was now, and he wanted to talk. The scheduled meeting with Brandon Hale lingered in Emily's thoughts like a distant thundercloud, not ominous, but impossible to ignore. It was set for 3 o'clock on a Thursday, in one of the smaller boardrooms on the top floor. No description beyond the subject line. No attached agenda. Just her name and his, placed side by side. The morning of the meeting, she arrived earlier than usual. The summit had officially ended the day before, and the office was quieter now, pulsing with a soft hum of post-event fatigue. Some teams were still clearing out equipment. Others returned to their usual projects. But for Emily, everything had shifted. She moved through her morning tasks with composed efficiency, finishing residual reports from the Step Forward initiative and compiling a follow-up summary requested by Annika. At lunch, she skipped the cafeteria and walked outside instead, pacing the quiet edge of a nearby plaza, letting the cool October air settle her thoughts. She didn't know what to expect from Brandon Hale. She had never been in a one-on-one meeting with anyone at his level, and though he now knew who she was, likely through internal reports or executive briefings, she had no idea what he thought of her work or of her personally. At 2:45, she stepped into the elevator and pressed a button for the 20th floor. The top level of Hale and Orion's headquarters was a different world, sleek, minimal, near silent. The carpet softened each step, and the panoramic windows offered a view of the entire city skyline. She found the assigned room, Boardroom D, already lit, with a glass table at its center and 2 chairs facing each other. Brandon Hale was already there. He stood when she entered, gesturing politely. "Emily Carter, thank you for making time." She nodded, keeping her voice steady. "Of course. Thank you for inviting me." He was dressed in a dark charcoal suit, no tie, sleeves rolled slightly at the cuffs. He looked every bit the executive face of a multi-million-dollar company, but there was a visible fatigue behind his eyes, a weight, perhaps, from the summit's intensity or the scrutiny that came with his position. He motioned for her to sit. They both did. For a moment, silence filled the room. Then he leaned forward slightly, his tone calm but direct. "I wanted to meet you in person. The work you did on the summit was exceptional, especially the mentorship event. I read everything. The feedback, the response. It was impactful." Emily held his gaze. "Thank you. I had a lot of support." He nodded. "True, but the idea came from you. And I have to admit, I didn't expect someone in your position to step forward like that." She didn't bristle at the comment. It wasn't insulting. It was honest. "I didn't expect to be given the chance," she replied. "But when I saw the opening, I took it." Brandon tapped the edge of the table thoughtfully. "I also understand this isn't our first meeting." She looked up, surprised. He met her eyes. "I didn't recognize you until someone mentioned your background." "The diner." Emily blinked. A moment of silence passed. "I remember the evening," he continued. "Not clearly at first. But after I read your profile and saw your photo, it came back." She didn't interrupt. She let him speak. "I said something careless that night. Something that probably didn't seem significant to me, but clearly stuck with you, and probably hurt." Emily considered her response carefully. "It didn't define me," she said, "but it reminded me that being underestimated isn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes it's subtle. And when it is, it's easy to let it slide. But I decided not to." Brandon nodded slowly. "You didn't retaliate. You didn't use that moment to call me out. You used it to build something." "I didn't need you to notice me back then," she said quietly. "But I needed to notice myself. That's what changed." He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed lightly. "You're not the same person I saw that night," he said. "I am," she corrected. "You just seem more now." A long pause followed. Then he offered a faint smile, not performative, but genuine. "Fair enough." For the next 20 minutes, The meeting shifted into something more strategic. He asked about her long-term interests, what she wanted to do within the company, what she thought needed to change internally. Emily spoke honestly, but without bitterness. She discussed the communication gaps between departments, the missed opportunities in employee development, and the need for greater internal mentorship, not just from the top down, but laterally between colleagues with different strengths. Brandon listened closely. He didn't interrupt or steer the conversation. At the end, he closed his notebook and stood. "I think we need more people like you in the room," he said. Emily rose as well. "I think there are more already here. They just need someone to see them." He extended his hand. "Thank you, Emily." She shook it firmly. "Thank you for the meeting." As she exited the boardroom and walked back to the elevator, her pulse slowed. The conversation had been everything it needed to be: respectful, open, transformative. She didn't feel vindicated. She didn't feel victorious. She felt seen, and that was enough. Back at her desk, Colin stopped by with a subtle grin. "I heard you had a visitor." She tilted her head. Word travels fast. "He's not one to meet with junior staff often," Colin said. "Impressive." Emily didn't reply. She returned to her work. That evening, as she packed up to leave, her phone buzzed with a new internal message. It was from Annika, just a subject line and one sentence. Subject, follow-up. Message: "You'll want to check the senior development agenda for next week." She opened the attachment. Her name was listed under the new Mentorship Initiative Task Force, alongside department heads and directors. She read it twice, then folded her coat over her arm and stepped into the hallway. The company had noticed, and this time they weren't just applauding her work. They were inviting her into the rooms where the next chapter would be written. The days following Emily's meeting with Brandon Hale unfolded in a way she hadn't anticipated. There was no dramatic shift in her daily routine, no red carpets or dramatic announcements, but the tone of her work life subtly changed. Doors that had previously been shut began to open, not all at once, but gradually, deliberately, as if the company itself was beginning to see her through a new lens. Her inclusion in the Mentorship Initiative Task Force was the first sign. The meetings were held bi-weekly and attended by key department heads, mid-level managers, and a few rising staff members identified as future contributors. Emily was the youngest and least experienced among them, but she quickly established her value not through bold declarations, but through clear insights, concise notes, and an uncanny ability to see across departmental blind spots. In one meeting, the discussion turned to why existing mentorship programs were underutilized. The marketing director blamed a lack of structure. The HR lead suggested employees were simply too busy. Emily listened for 15 minutes before speaking. "I think the problem isn't structure or time," she said. "It's fear." The room quieted. Junior employees are afraid of seeming needy. They don't want to bother senior staff. And on the other side, some senior staff might feel insecure about mentoring because they're afraid they don't have all the answers. There's a perception gap on both sides. No one interrupted her. If we focus less on formal mentorship and more on structured peer conversations, guided sessions between employees of different levels but similar experiences, we create space for learning without pressure. It becomes mutual, respectful, empowering. Annika, who was chairing the meeting, looked at Emily thoughtfully. "You just outlined the framework for Phase 2. Can you draft a model?" Emily nodded. "I can have it ready by end of week." And she did. Within a month, peer circles became a pilot program in 3 departments. Participation doubled expectations within the first 10 days. Quietly, without fanfare, Emily was reshaping internal culture. Outside those meetings, her own work began evolving too. Colin pulled her into larger projects, data reviews on internal process efficiency, resource allocation analyses, and early-stage project briefs. She was no longer viewed as the assistant on the edge of operations. She was now contributing to the center of it. One Wednesday afternoon, as she was finishing a summary report, an unexpected email landed in her inbox. It was from Brandon Hale's office. Subject: Internal Development Committee Leadership Culture Session. The message was short. Emily had been invited to present alongside two others, during a leadership roundtable discussion. The audience, senior executives. Topic, bridging generational perspectives in the workplace. She reread the email 3 times. The session was scheduled for the following week in a private salon near the top of the building. Emily spent her evenings preparing, outlining key points, identifying examples from her own experience, and researching generational data on workplace dynamics. She didn't want to sound rehearsed, but she needed to be ready. The day of the presentation, she dressed with more care than usual. A simple navy dress, subtle earrings, hair pulled into a clean, low bun. She carried a slim folder with her notes and arrived 10 minutes early. Inside the room, she was greeted by a blend of familiar and unfamiliar faces. Brandon Hale was already seated at the center of the long, curved table, speaking quietly with 2 directors. He looked up as she entered and gave her a small nod. This time, she felt no intimidation, only readiness. When it was her turn to speak, she stood with her notes but did not read from them. I was raised by parents who worked hourly jobs. My introduction to leadership wasn't through books or classes. It was through watching how people handled pressure, how they treated those who couldn't push back. She paused, letting the words settle. What I've noticed at Hale and Orion is a desire to evolve, but also a fear of losing authority. Many younger employees come with ideas, energy, and digital fluency, but they carry the weight of perceived inexperience. Meanwhile, senior staff hold years of wisdom, but they often feel their voices are slowly becoming less relevant in the changing tide. She looked around the room. If we can find a way to connect those experiences, if we can stop assuming that innovation belongs to the young and stability to the old, we might create something better than either side could offer alone. When she finished, there was a moment of stillness. Then one of the directors leaned forward. That's probably the most balanced take I've heard in a long time. Another added, we need to build structures that reflect exactly that. Brandon didn't speak immediately, but when the discussion ended and others began to gather their things, he stood and approached her. You delivered exactly what I hoped you would, he said. No defensiveness, just perspective. Emily looked him in the eye. That's how Progress works. He smiled. There's a project coming up I think you'd be perfect for. It's still early, but I'll have Annika reach out when it's ready. And with that, he moved on to speak with another executive. Later that evening, Emily sat at her desk, reviewing feedback from the session. Her name had appeared in 3 executive notes of recognition, and one manager had already reached out to request a consultation on applying her peer circles model to their division. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling for a moment. She was no longer the girl from the diner trying to prove herself. She was becoming something else entirely. A catalyst. Emily's role continued to evolve in ways that felt both sudden and earned. Following her presentation at the leadership roundtable, she found herself fielding invitations from departments outside her original scope. Teams in human resources, technology, and internal communications wanted her input, not as a symbolic young voice, but as a thoughtful contributor with a grounded understanding of the company's inner workings. She never pretended to have all the answers, but she asked the right questions, and more importantly, she listened. Annika, ever attentive to shift within the company, pulled Emily aside after a cross-functional meeting. You become a reference point, she said. People mention your name when talking about the future. Emily didn't let the compliment distract her. She stayed focused on work, always ensuring her contributions were consistent and strategic. The summit had been a defining moment, but she knew sustainable impact wasn't made through a single event. It was the accumulation of choices, the resilience to maintain vision after the spotlight moved on. It was during one of her late afternoons in the internal development office, reviewing employee feedback from the peer circle's rollout, that she received another email from Brandon Hale's office. This time, it wasn't about a meeting or a presentation. The message was simple. Would you be available for a short one-on-one discussion this week? No formal agenda, just an open conversation on company culture and inclusion. She responded with a few available time slots. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. That day, she arrived to find Brandon already in the room. this time dressed more casually, sleeves rolled and tie absent. The boardroom was smaller than the previous one, more intimate, and the mood was noticeably relaxed. "Thanks for coming," he said, gesturing for her to take a seat. "I realize I've pulled you into a lot of these meetings lately." She sat across from him, placing her notepad on the table but keeping it closed. "I don't mind. It's been enlightening." He nodded, then leaned back. "I wanted this conversation to be less formal. No titles, no performance evaluations. Just two people trying to understand the company we're both part of." Emily appreciated the approach. It wasn't performative. He seemed genuinely interested. He continued, "I've been doing a lot of thinking since the summit, about the future of Hale and Orion, about how we position ourselves as innovative but have, in some ways, fallen behind culturally. We move fast, but we don't always look inward." Emily stayed quiet, waiting for him to continue. "You forced some conversations that needed to happen," he said. "Not by shouting, not by tearing things down, just by showing what's possible when someone who isn't already in the spotlight makes a contribution that matters." Emily folded her hands, choosing her words carefully. "I think people are more willing to contribute than leadership realizes. But if the environment doesn't feel safe, they stay silent." Brandon nodded. "That's been the hardest part for me to admit. That somewhere along the way, we built a culture that rewards presence over input. The loudest voices win, and the quiet ones, like yours, had to fight twice as hard just to be heard." "I didn't fight for attention," Emily said. "I fought for meaning. I wanted my work to have value, not visibility." He looked at her, something close to admiration in his eyes. "That's a rare mindset. Most people chase recognition." She offered a small smile. "Recognition is fleeting. Value lasts longer." There was a pause, filled with the low hum of the building's ventilation system. Then Brandon leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Would you consider advising on a broader initiative? Something beyond just internal culture. A framework for how we can redesign our mentorship, hiring, and development systems company-wide. From pipeline to promotion." Emily blinked. "As part of a team?" "No," he said. "As one of the leads." She took a slow breath. It wasn't the offer that stunned her. It was the tone. Brandon Hale, the CEO who had once dismissed her without a second thought, was now asking her to help shape the company's future. "I'd need time," she said honestly, "to map the scope, to understand what resources would be available, and to determine where I could be most effective." He smiled. "That's exactly the kind of answer I was hoping for." They spoke for another 20 minutes, discussing structural gaps, employee engagement, and the importance of shifting from token gestures to embedded practices. Brandon didn't dominate the conversation. He shared where appropriate, questioned when curious, and absorbed every word with a level of attentiveness Emily found both unexpected and reassuring. As the meeting came to a close, he stood and extended his hand, not as a formality, but with a quiet sincerity. "I owe you more than one apology," he said. "Not just for how I treated you that night in the diner, but for how many others I've likely overlooked in similar ways." Emily accepted the handshake. "The best way to apologize is to do better going forward." He held her gaze. "That's the plan." As she left the boardroom and returned to her floor, she passed several employees in the hallway who nodded or offered quiet greetings. A few months ago, they might not have even looked up. Back at her desk, she opened a new folder on her laptop and titled it Inclusive Leadership Initiative Draft. She didn't start by writing policy or listing strategies. She started by writing names of people she had met in the last few months who had something valuable to offer but hadn't yet been given the space to lead. People who, like her, had waited patiently for an invitation that might never come. She would not wait anymore. She would create the invitation herself. The following months moved swiftly. What had begun as a quiet role in operations turned into something far more significant. Emily now found herself regularly invited into strategy sessions, policy reviews, and leadership roundtables. But the most transformative change came when Brandon Hale formally appointed her to co-lead the new Inclusion and Innovation Initiative. It wasn't a symbolic position. It was operational, visible, and accountable. The announcement went out in a company-wide newsletter. listing her by name, accompanied by a short summary of the program's vision. Most notable was the final sentence. Emily Carter, previously a junior assistant in operations, will serve as co-lead of this initiative, with a mandate to help redefine our internal pathways for talent development, inclusion, and innovation. Emily received dozens of emails and messages within the first hour of the announcement. Some were congratulatory. Others were curious. A few came from junior employees who simply wrote, "Thank you for making space for the rest of us." Her first official task was to build a team, not of executives, but of people who understood what it meant to be overlooked, underestimated, or undervalued. She wanted diversity in background, discipline, and thought. So she reached out to people from IT, administration, customer relations, and facilities. Not just high performers, but high potential individuals who hadn't yet been given a platform. They met weekly, usually in a small corner room on the 12th floor, with whiteboards and rolling chairs, and a shared sense that something new was being built. Emily didn't dictate. She facilitated. She encouraged every voice, challenged every assumption, and guided discussions toward practical solutions. One day, they reviewed the internal hiring data from the past 5 years. A pattern emerged. Most mid-level roles were filled by lateral hires, not internal promotions. People aren't growing within the company, said one analyst. They're coming in from the outside, or they're giving up and leaving, added a colleague from human resources. Emily circled 2 points on the board: block pipelines and perception gaps. What if the issue isn't skill? She asked. What if it's visibility? People can't apply for roles they don't know exist. And managers can't promote potential they've never seen. That question led to the birth of a new internal platform called Spotlight, a company-wide digital showcase where employees could self-nominate or be peer-nominated for skill-based opportunities, cross-training sessions, and temporary projects. It gave visibility to employees from all levels and invited departments to consider talent from beyond the traditional pool. Within 2 months, Spotlight had matched over 40 employees with new internal opportunities. The company started to shift, not from the top down, but from the center out. Emily's story began circulating quietly inside the company, not through marketing campaigns or speeches, but through conversations in elevators, side chats during meetings, and department updates. People who had once seen her as the assistant from operations now spoke of her as someone reshaping the culture from within. And with that recognition came new responsibilities. Annika approached her one afternoon with a proposal. We want you to present at the annual leadership retreat. Theme is Foundations for the Future. You'd represent the innovation stream. Emily hesitated. The retreat was known for being high profile. It was where executive-level plans were revealed and where Brandon Hale gave his annual address. You don't have to accept, Annika said, but I think it's time they hear your voice, not just see your results. Emily agreed, and she spent the next 3 weeks preparing a presentation that blended data, story, and vision. She didn't want to lecture. She wanted to remind the room of what was possible when overlooked talent was not just acknowledged, but embraced. The day of the retreat arrived. It was held in a conference center just outside the city. The main room was expansive, with tiered seating, elegant lighting, and a central stage flanked by massive screens. The attendees included department heads, regional directors, and senior advisors. It was the most powerful room she had ever stepped into. When it was her turn, she took the stage with quiet confidence. No flash, no theatrics. Just truth. She opened with a simple statement. 2 years ago, I served coffee to a room of executives at a local diner. One of them made a remark that stung, not because it was cruel, but because it made me invisible. She let the silence linger. That moment wasn't the beginning of my career, but it reminded me why I wanted more. She then walked them through the journey, not as a story of personal triumph, but as a case study in overlooked value, misconnections, and the transformative power of belief. She introduced the Spotlight program, shared its impact metrics, and outlined a proposed expansion to include mentorship tracking, learning modules, and project-based leadership roles. Talent doesn't look like one thing, she said, and leadership doesn't always raise its hand. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it endures. But when we create room for it, real room, it shows up. She closed with a soft, but firm call to action. We cannot build a future by reinforcing the past. We need new frameworks, new ears, and the courage to let new voices lead. When she stepped off the stage, the applause wasn't thunderous, but it was lasting. It followed her back to her seat, accompanied by nods from executives who had never before spoken to her directly. Later that afternoon, Brandon Hale stood at the podium to deliver his annual address. He opened with a comment that surprised the entire room. "Before I begin," he said, "I want to acknowledge the person who reminded me, and many of us, what leadership really looks like. Emily Carter." He didn't embellish. He didn't turn it into a marketing piece. He just let her name stand, unadorned but unmistakably respected. That evening, after the retreat ended, Emily stood by the large windows overlooking the city lights, holding a cup of tea. Several colleagues approached to thank her, but one moment stood out. A man from facilities, maybe in his late 40s, approached hesitantly. "You don't know me," he said, "but I've been here 18 years. I've seen a lot of change. Most of it stays on the surface. But what you said today, it felt different, felt real." Emily smiled. "That's all I hoped for." He nodded once. "Keep going." And as he turned to leave, Emily stood a little straighter. She had come a long way from the diner. But the real journey, the one that mattered most, was just beginning. The first snowfall of winter arrived quietly, dusting the city in a soft white haze that softened its edges and made everything feel still. Emily sat by the window of her modest but now much more comfortable apartment, watching the slow descent of snowflakes onto the streetlights below. Her life had changed in ways she had once only imagined in whispered thoughts, moments too delicate to speak aloud for fear they'd vanish. But they hadn't vanished. They had taken root. Hale and Orion's leadership initiative, once only an idea on her laptop, was now a fully operational program. Spotlight had expanded across 4 branches. Peer circles had become a permanent part of onboarding, and internal promotions were up by nearly 30% compared to the previous year. Employees now routinely cited inclusion and mentorship as reasons for staying at the company, a stark contrast of feedback she had read in her early weeks. More importantly, people who had never felt seen were now leading projects, proposing ideas, and mentoring others in return. The change wasn't loud. It was steady, persistent, and real, just like her. Yet, amid the growth, Emily had started thinking about something else, something quieter than promotions or company-wide meetings. A promise she had made to herself long before any of this began. One afternoon, she took a personal day and boarded a city bus headed toward the west side, where the streets were lined with aging buildings and modest shops, and where a small diner with foggy windows still stood beneath a faded red awning. Millie's diner hadn't changed much. The same bell chimed when she pushed open the door. The smell of brewed coffee and grilled cheese welcomed her like an old friend. Behind the counter, Marlene stood in her familiar spot, wiping down the register, glasses perched on her head. Marlene looked up, squinting, then her eyes widened. "Well, I'll be," she said, breaking into a grin. "If it isn't our little business shark." Emily laughed and walked over. They hugged briefly across the counter, the embrace as natural as breathing. "Got the day off?" Marlene asked. "Sort of," Emily replied. "I owed someone a visit." Marlene tilted her head. "You mean the man who sat by the window?" Emily nodded. "Do you remember him?" "Of course. Tipped like clockwork. Quiet. Kind eyes. Always asked about your night classes." "I want to thank him," Emily said, "for noticing me when I didn't think anyone was." Marlene smiled. "He comes in Tuesdays. Late lunch. You just missed him last week." Emily ordered a coffee and waited, sitting at the same booth she used to wipe down every night. The walls still bore faded photos of the diner from decades past. The menu still had handwritten edits where items had been added or retired. And though the space was humble, it held a dignity she now understood more deeply. At 2:30, the door opened, and just as Marlene predicted, the man from that distant evening entered, his coat dusted with snow, scarf tucked neatly into his collar. He was older than she remembered, but then again, so was she. He paused when he saw her, his expression shifting from recognition to surprise. "Hello," he said, approaching slowly. I wasn't sure if it was you. It's me, Emily said, standing. Can I sit? Of course. They sat in silence for a moment. Then he offered a soft smile. You look well. I am, she replied. And I came to say thank you. He raised an eyebrow. For what? For seeing me. That night, you didn't say much, but it meant more than you probably knew. He nodded slowly, then looked down at his hands. I've worked in education all my life, he said. Seen thousands of students come and go. Most don't remember you, but a few, you remember them, because they carry something. A spark, maybe, or a question the world hasn't answered yet. Emily said nothing. She let the words settle. I saw it in you, he continued. Not because you spoke up, but because you kept showing up. People like you always find a way. She smiled. I'm trying to make sure others get the chance too. He looked proud, not in the way of someone taking credit, but like a gardener seeing a flower bloom in a place no one thought it could grow. After they talked for a while longer, she walked him out to the sidewalk. Snow had started falling again, light and steady. As he waved goodbye and disappeared around the corner, Emily stood for a moment, watching the street, the diner, the memory of her former self still lingering somewhere in the quiet air. Later that week, she was invited to speak at a local high school. A teacher had reached out after reading about her in a leadership newsletter. She agreed without hesitation. The students sat in folding chairs, most of them half listening at first. But as she spoke about starting small, being overlooked, staying patient, they began to lean in. She told them about the mistakes she made, the night she thought about quitting, the unexpected paths that led her forward. You don't have to be the loudest voice to make a difference, she said. You just have to keep showing up, keep learning, keep asking, what can I do with what I have right now? After the talk, a girl approached her, notebook in hand, eyes wide. Do you think someone like me could work in a place like that? Emily smiled. Absolutely. But you don't have to wait to get there to start becoming that person. You start now. On the ride home, Emily looked out the bus window, watching the city pass by in flickers of light and shadow. She thought about how far she had come, not just in status or recognition, but in conviction, in clarity. She was no longer chasing belonging. She was building it, for herself and for others. And she would keep building, one step at a time.